fan of Ben?
Of Ben has of chat very big.
Under his eye. How's volume? Testing. Do you want to turn up that dial a little bit on the left?
Which one? This
The left one? Just twist it up a little bit. Just a little bit.
Blessed be the chat. May YouTube open. May you have opened your YouTube window. May Susan open. Susan is my lord. Did Simply read the book? No.
Cristine did not read the book. But
Women aren't allowed to read. You know what happens.
yeah. That's right. Women aren't allowed to read. Cristine is a big fan of the television show.
Yeah.
I read the book, and then we watched the first season together. Mm-hmm. Recently, like last week. Too much music? Okay, one sec. Who's got time to read? I don't know. Cristine should probably celebrate her right to read by reading books, you know? I listened to the audiobook. You know what? That is, I don't want to give anything away. So one big difference between the book and the show is the ending. And there's a reason why listening to the book actually makes sense for this book. Can you guess?
Because you can hear her voice tremble? I don't know. Like, voice acting?
Think of like the story of The Handmaid.
Because
Who would have told that
like
story?
She's writing it in her diary style? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, we'll get into it in a bit. I think you'll like this detail. Okay. The book is a little bit meta.
But first, see what chat did. Did they read? Can they read?
35% of chat read the book. 27% have seen the show. 25% can't read. They're all women.
Yeah.
And 14% of people are Margaret Atwood.
That's a lot. I was expecting like 10%. 14. Wow.
Wow.
Shocked.
I'm actually slightly encouraged that 34% of people read the book. 35, 34, somewhere in between there. Last month it was kind of low.
This is a more popular book, right?
I'm going to say something right now. This was the best book we read in Booktendo this year.
Okay.
It was my favorite book that we read.
That's why they turned it into a show, I think.
Yeah, maybe that's why. Because they know women can't read, so they still want women to see it.
Yeah, exactly. You know? In a society where women can't read the book, they can watch the book.
Although we live in a society where people have freedoms, they just choose not to exercise them, like reading. You know?
Just because you are free to do something doesn't mean you have to do it. Like, what? Doesn't mean it's a freedom.
Well,
what?
It is a freedom. I find books about like the world going to shit. It's usually more believable to me if people were participated in their own losing of freedoms, let's say.
Yeah.
Like in 1984, it's like, oh, like we're all just subjugated by this totalitarian government, which is terrifying. But then you have like Brave New World, where it's like, hey, we decided just to all medicate ourselves so we wouldn't feel or think anything. And I just think a much more believable vision of a future dystopia is one in which people are participants in their own enslavement, let's say.
Well, Serena is an example of that, right?
There are women who participate in the society. Yeah, let's get into the book. Well, let's talk about The Handmaid's Tale.
Do you want to just like give a summary first for the 25% who can't read?
I did my homework.
Okay.
This month we read The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. How's the camera?
Or watched. Good? Hi, I can't read. I'm woman.
I am woman.
I'm a special guest, by the way.
Special guest Cristine.
I don't normally go here.
Is this a collab?
I guess so.
Would you like a grape?
No, I have a Zyler though.
Well, you can have a grape and a Zyler.
So much freedom.
Preconceptions. I always like starting with preconceptions. It's rare that you go in blind to a book, right? Mm-hmm. My preconception was Margaret Atwood is sort of like the Canadian author people mention. Canadians have a bit of an inferiority complex because we live right next to the United States, and the United States is like the cultural exporter of the world, right? Everyone thinks of American media as like global media. So
you can just finish chewing. You've been chewing the same grape for like 30 seconds.
In Canada, we have a little bit of an inferiority complex that we like to point out how we punch above our weight with cultural exports. So like artists, actors, musicians. For authors, I don't think there's a very long list of like Canadian authors people know around the world or internationally. I think Margaret Atwood is like the example of the Canadian author you can point to. And she's a good author.
Okay, so what's the preconception?
So my preconception is just that it was big famous Canadian book we should be proud of if we're proud that a Canadian woman can write a good book.
So like you think people thought that you should just like it because it's a Canadian author. So if you are a Canadian, you are required to think it's good. You know, CanCon.
CanCon.
Yeah, but that's not true. It is a very
It's not true. It's
well-received book, like universally, right?
It is a well-received book. I knew about like the general theme or content about like women being enslaved and used to as vessels to give people babies. I didn't know much beyond that.
Had you heard about the book before the show?
Yes.
Okay, so you were already like aware of it. Yeah.
But I did watch when the show first came out. We watched it like 5 years ago. So before I read the book, I had seen the show. I watched the show first.
Yeah.
I think in high schools in Canada, this must be a book that people read sometimes. I'm surprised it's not something that's... Do you think the sexual content is just too much? A lot of parents freak out that their kids would...
Well, I mean, it depends what age.
But like high school students. Is
I don't
anyone
know.
here in Canada in high school?
I feel like the books we read were like literally 50 years old. Like they only made us read books that were so old, like The Grapes of Wrath, or like just so boring. I don't know if it was just no one wanted to update their curriculum because it like took too much work. But like that's my recollection. We never read any books written in like the last 10 years.
Oh, I see. Well, this book was written in 1985.
I guess that was still within like 20 years of the time frame I'm talking about. But I mean like old books is what we read, like 50, 40
Like
years.
Charles Dickens.
Yeah, like that shit.
Like, I do see there are people in the chat who said they did read it in high school. And I saw someone say there isn't actually that much sexual content. Like, what is there is awful because it's like ceremonious rape, right? But yeah, in terms of the book and the show, it's not incredibly explicit or graphic. I'm sorry, I'll speak for the book. The book it doesn't like...
in the book, okay.
It's not graphically describing sex acts.
So is it just like alluding to assault?
Well, no. It's describes it happening, but I don't think some parent wringing their hands over like graphic depictions of sex has much of an argument.
My assumption is that like really religious parents wouldn't want this book read to their kids because it is a negative view of religion, basically, is how they might interpret it. So they don't like that being read to their child. Even if it's like more than just that, it's more of like almost a sociological look at human behavior, I think.
I really want to get into that because I think the book is obviously anti-religious. And I think Margaret Atwood has talked about how the book isn't anti-religious in a way that I find pretty disappointing.
Really?
But I want to get into it a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah, let's get into that.
Okay, do you have more slides? What's the
just
summary of the book?
I guess the other preconception is just the show existing and that having seen the show before reading the book changes the way you read the book too, right? In terms of who you're picturing and all that stuff. So let's do a plot summary, and then we'll get into the differences between the show and the book, okay?
Okay.
So The Handmaid's Tale is a dystopian novel set in the near future where women are becoming increasingly infertile due to environmental pollution and radiation exposure.
That's what they say.
They do explain this in the book.
Okay.
Is that in the show as well?
It's very briefly shown in the show, like during a slideshow, but it's like you can't really trust the people who are saying it. So I don't really know. Like, is there other factors? But they use that because they just use that to exert control.
So the book is overwhelmingly told from the perspective of Offred, your narrator protagonist, who you're right, is only hearing of this from information she has available to her, what she knew before the government was overthrown and what she's being told by the aunts or whoever. So you're right, there's no singular for sure answer until there's an epilogue that
At the end of the book?
at the end of the book, I don't want to give it away yet. There's an epilogue to the book that does give you some historical context.
Okay.
But just to provide a little bit more context, so women are increasingly infertile. So Christian fascist militants overthrow the United States government by coordinating terrorist attacks on the White House and Congress at the same time. And they suspend the Constitution and institute this new social order in the Republic of Gilead, where women are not able to own property or control their own reproductive freedom, and women are organized into these social classes based on their worth. They're basically treated as property. So some women become just sort of cooks or Marthas, just doing menial labor. There's wives of like the ruling class who still preserve some sort of, I don't want to say rights, but at least some privileges. But the story, The Handmaid's Tale, is told from the perspective of Offred, a handmaid in this society, who, by virtue of being a fertile woman, she's assigned to the home of a commander, and her role is to help this commander and his wife have a child through participating in these ceremonies, which is just really ritualized rape. That is the high-level concept. The actual story of Offred, the handmaid specifically, I guess I just want to touch point on a few of the plot points here. Or I do want to touch on the fact that it's near future. I think something important to the novel and why it works well is that Atwood talks about how she thought it was important that the novel doesn't contain anything. She uses a specific phrase, I can't remember now, but basically saying she didn't want to include anything in the novel that wasn't something that has happened in history in, countries where there's been dictatorships or things like that, right? And I think it helps the novel feel very grounded. There's no like weird technological invention that helps something. Like the plot doesn't rely on some futuristic technology. It feels very grounded in the here and now.
Okay.
And even though the book is written in the 80s, it kind of feels like this book could be happening at any time, you know?
Yes, because the premise of the vision for Gilead is also about returning to tradition. So they want the simplification of things. They don't want the luxuries of technology that are a distraction from your biological destiny and blah, blah, blah. So like you're kind of right that it doesn't matter if you look at this in the 80s or the 2000s or the 2020s. Their vision is to just return to tradition, which is very general, but you can kind of interpret that loosely as like people grow shit on farms. They just like hang out in their house that looks old, and like no one's doing anything with technology really.
There is a rejection of technology in the society. Part of me is kind of confusing what I may have read in the book versus seen in the show. But I do remember at one point there's like some discussion about like they sort of reject even the technology of knowing if this is in the book. In the book, sometimes the handmaids get pregnant and give birth to these like deformed babies. Like that's pretty common because of the issues with infertility and all that. And
they don't use technology
even though
to
they
prevent
presumably have the technology from before to, like tell if a baby has problems, they just don't do it. They don't do anything.
Because it's not God's will.
And what would they even do with that information? They don't believe in abortion. Obviously, you can't do that.
Yeah.
So it's not like they can do anything. But they do sort of...
So they're just willfully blind to it and then use the justification of religion
and they
like
blame
God's
the
fate.
woman. It was God's will, or the woman's at fault for giving birth to a not perfect child. And they consider that child not even human because in their religious thinking, they should respect the sanctity of life, even if that's like an imperfect child. But they consider it like an unchild. And it's just sort of disguised. Like they don't think of it as a human. An unbaby was the term. Yeah.
Okay.
So Offred's story in the book is very similar to the Offred the story and the main plot points are very similar between the book and the TV show. So Offred shows up in this home with this commander and his wife. His wife is Serena Joy in the book. Is that her name?
Mrs. Waterford. Yes, Mrs. Waterford.
So, a lot of the story is just told from the perspective of this woman who has no agency or autonomy over her life. So a lot of the book is basically describing her boredom, her thinking in her head.
Serena's boredom?
No, sorry, Offred's
Offred.
boredom. I'm in my room. I'm thinking. I'm doing wordplay in my head.
Yeah.
I have no, like, she doesn't call it her room. I'm in the room. She doesn't own anything. She doesn't know anything. She notices in the closet, just like in the show, that someone has written in Latin.
Someone from before? Was it the same storyline?
It's very, yeah, basically. Written in Latin is something in the closet, which is evidence that she is not the first handmaid to have existed in that home. Mm-hmm. Big difference in the book is that the commander and his wife are an older couple. She's a former, televangelist, she used to sing gospel songs on television as part of
So she wasn't like an author or a...
No, in the show they give her a more sort of serious, like, political figure background, almost, like our speaker. Whereas here she is, one sec. She's sort of old. She walks around with a cane. The commander is described as kind of pathetic with gray hair. So anyway, she lives in this, I wouldn't describe it as boredom. It's more like willfully turning your brain off to get through trauma. Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, she explicitly talks about boredom. So it's both those things. After a period of time in the home, Nick, the driver, comes up to Offred's room, which isn't supposed to happen. And he kisses her.
Like the first time randomly?
She barely knows him at this point.
Okay, that's kind of weird.
Uh-huh. And then he goes, the commander wants to see you in his room. Tomorrow, come down at 9:00.
Okay.
So she goes down the next night. She doesn't, she can't say no. She has no autonomy here. But she knows, this is a risky thing that might result in her being killed. And her assumption is, the commander wants to engage in, sex acts that aren't allowed in Gilead or something to that effect, right? But he just wants to play Scrabble.
So the same as in the show.
It is the same. So, and she finds this hilarious and has trouble not laughing at it. But she plays Scrabble with him. And she can't really figure out, what his motivation is in this. It almost seems like he wants to impress her in a way or please her for a reason she doesn't understand. She keeps coming back, and this goes on for a while. At the same time, I guess we'll just do a very abbreviated version of this. She hasn't gotten pregnant, and it's been several months. So the wife of the home, Serena, at one point eventually comes to her and says, hey, this is your last chance, you haven't had a child. But then she admits, hey, maybe he can't.
Who,
maybe
Serena?
Serena is saying this. Maybe she says, hey, maybe he can't get you pregnant. Mm-hmm. So she doesn't suggest. She basically describes that Offred should sleep with Nick, the driver, to see if she can get pregnant that way.
It's the same as in the show.
So it does show, this is skipping over the course of a lot of the book, but the idea basically that all these rich people are this sort of ruling class are sort of hypocritical and are willing to bend the rules if it suits theirs. She truly wants a baby. So the Offred, the handmaid, is sort of caught in between the husband sneaking her down to play Scrabble, and now the wife wanting her to break the rules to get pregnant with another guy. All of these things will get her killed and have her blamed if anything goes wrong or anything is found out.
That's by design.
Yes. After a while of playing Scrabble, I'm trying to remember what happens first. She eventually becomes more comfortable with the commander and realizes, she asks him about the Latin phrase in the closet. Same thing happens in the show. She wants him to describe, or she asks him what it means, the Latin phrase. And he says, it's not even proper Latin. It's just something some schoolboy would say, like being upset with his teachers. Don't let the bastards grind you down. Poorly
Yeah.
translated. And I misunderstood this the first time I saw the show, actually. I thought that was evidence that, like, the commander had actually grown up in that house and he had written it in the closet, and that it was actually him. But the point in both the show and the book, I realize, is that the handmaid that had been in that home before her had also spent time with the commander doing whatever. So that's the only way she would have known that phrase, to write it in the closet.
Yeah.
So she realizes that the reason the commander is being nice to her is that he just wants to make her life bearable enough that she doesn't do the same thing the last handmaid did, which is that she hung herself
In her room.
in her room to escape just the awfulness of being in that role. The commander then takes her to Jezebel's. So this happens in the book as well. So basically, he sneaks Offred out of the house. He makes her put on this like goofy sequin sexy outfit and takes her where a lot of the ruling old men go to still be surrounded by
To break the rules.
break the rules, drink, and have prostitutes around, basically. And this is where Offred sees her friend Moira, who she thought escaped from the community, is actually just at Jezebel's and has lost a bit of her spark for escaping. Like, she had thought she may have gotten out or been killed. She didn't know. This is her first time seeing her. And it ends on a bit of a sad note that she, like, in the book, Moira is much more of the heroic figure than Offred is. Offred's a more meek character, and Moira represents the person who did find a way of escaping. It's Moira on her own that tied up one of the ants and got out of, escaped from the center, dressed up as an ant, and made it to a safe house. But like, they didn't really know what happened to her after that. Were the Jezebel's girls unable to get pregnant? So Moira became a Jezebel because they realized she was like a corrupting influence if they just put her back with the girls. So yeah, corrupting influences or women who were actually sex workers from before were sort of just put in this hotel.
Well, not necessarily. Like that other character of Glenn, I believe, like they very briefly in the, I don't know about the book, but
Yeah.
in the show, she briefly said like, my life used to be terrible. And I think she said something along the lines of like, I was a junkie who used to bend over for $5 or something, like something really briefly. And so she was like, you better appreciate this life, June, because her life, in her opinion, was so much worse. So she did allude to the fact that I think she was either doing sex work or at least something along those lines of like, in her opinion, it was worse. So I don't think you automatically go to Jezebel's just because you're
I think being unable to have a child is probably the biggest
not
factor.
of Glenn, the other one, not of Glenn.
Of Warren?
No.
The one who had her tongue.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I
Which
know who
was
you're
actually
talking
season 2 and not, it wasn't Janine. It was another one. I can't remember, but it's not a main character. It was, she had a smaller role in the show.
So yeah, this exchange didn't happen. It's acknowledged in the book that like some women were willing participants in this because they'd rather have a tiny bit of power than no power at all. But that's mostly in describing like some of the ants and actually how people ended up being ants more than anything.
Mm-hmm.
Can we talk about how they hated Janine in the book?
Who hated Janine?
Yeah, Offred in the book, in the show, Janine is sort of a sympathetic figure, and June tries to help her basically in the first season, whereas Offred is pretty doesn't like Janine in the
Why?
book.
It's not explained.
Well, how do I explain this? When she's just being sort of like annoyous and pious and might get them in trouble, it's not like, oh, poor Janine. It's just like, oh, fuck this person. You know what I mean?
Was Janine's character in the book too agreeable to the circumstances around her, and that made June's character like not really like her? Or
So
no?
the first time you meet Janine, she is pregnant and just gloating to all the other handmaids about how she's pregnant and how she's being treated so well.
Yeah.
So it's just the character has a different,
Like rubbing it in, kind of.
yeah, and I don't know. I think it's a realistic thing that, like, yes, you'd be sympathetic to other people in your position, but you're still gonna be dislike other people in your position being treated differently.
Mm-hmm.
She also wasn't there jealousy that there was jealousy. She was pregnant. So where are we? We went to Jezebel's. Offred starts developing. So Offred has sort of her partner Handmaid, who is Emily, is her real name.
That's of Glen.
That's
sorry.
but of Glen.
Actually, sorry. The girl I was referring to, her name was also of Glen. It was the next of Glen.
That's
so
right.
That is what it is.
You're
but
right.
she has smaller roles, so she's not. Yeah.
Yeah. So in the book, Offred becomes sort of aware there is a bit of a resistance in Gilead from her walks.
Is it called Mayday?
With
It's awesome.
kind of, well, yes. So on these walks, of Glen at one point just like casually says, "Oh, it's a nice May Day we're having." Just like they're just going for a walk in May. And like she just like, why
May.
does she say that? You know what I mean? You find out later that was her sort of testing, because May Day is not necessarily the name of the operation as much as, like, at least from between the handmaids, it was a bit of a code word to let each other know that they were, you know, interested in resisting this society they live in. I think what some people maybe find disappointing about the book, and a difference between the Offred in the show and the book, though, is so Offred basically starts seeing Nick, and that becomes her way of rebelling against the position she's been put, and Nick accepts her overtures. Like, she just ends up developing a romantic relationship with Nick, showing up at his house and sleeping with him. And at that point, whereas previously she was interested in Glen, sort of dropping hints about like, hey, can you get us information? We're like trying to find things out. She basically starts resenting that and saying like, she's just sort of numb to it. She's sort of beaten down. She doesn't really want to participate in the resistance. She wants sort of Glen to stop telling her these things. Towards the end of the book, they go to a salvaging ceremony, which is they go to a ceremony where it's just like a public execution, essentially, that the handmaids get to participate in. So at first you see just a few people are hung for being enemies of the state, although it's not actually, basically it's suggested that previously you would be told why people were being hung in this public spectacle. But in the show they mention like, because when we tell people why people are being hung for like treason and explain what they did, that just causes other people to get inspired to do that thing. So they're just like, we're not going to tell you why we're even
So they're
killing
not
these
even
people.
doing deterrence, if that was their logic.
Yeah. They do bring out one guy for the handmaids to kill, and it's just like the show. They say
stoned
this
him?
guy raped a handmaid,
But was that a lie?
and she was pregnant. And so Emily, of Glen, says, like, speaking to Offred, goes, this guy didn't do that. Like, I think he's one of us in the resistance. So she tries to mercifully kill him quickly in the ceremony. Mm-hmm. And so, like the next day or a little bit later, Offred goes to go for her walk, and her partner of Glen, Emily, isn't there anymore. It's a new one. She realized, like, oh shit, like something's happening. She tries to feel it out with this new one and realizes she's not interested in talking about anything that they're not supposed to. And you find out that Emily, the original of Glen, was the Eyes, who are like the secret service of Gilead, came to take her away, but she killed herself before they could get her. So that's Emily's conclusion in the book. That's what you were told anyway. You can't say for certain,
because it's always
that's what it is. And actually the new Offred goes like, hey, I don't want to, sorry, the new Glen you think is just sort of pious and doesn't want anything to do, but when they're about to leave, she's the one who tells her this. She's like, hey, like, I don't want to, you basically get the vibe like, hey, I don't want to talk to you about resistance or anything, But before I leave her the first time, she goes, this is what happened to the last one. She lets her know.
So that's a big difference.
That is a big difference. So Offred goes back to the house, and she gets confronted by Serena, who realizes by finding makeup on her coat that the husband had snuck her to Jezebel's. So Offred doesn't know what's going to happen to her. She's waiting in her room, and she hears like the black car approach, like the eyes are coming to get her. And Nick bursts into her room, and he goes, and this is a bit of a difference. He goes, "It's Mayday." And she goes like, "What?" And he goes like, "Trust me, go with them." And so these two men then enter the room. She goes downstairs with them. Nick disappears. And then the commander and Serena are like, "What's going on? Do you have the authority to do this?" And they're like, "Yeah, it's crimes against the state." And they throw her into a car. And just like the end of the first season of the show, it ends with the exact same narration of like, "I'm giving myself into the hands of strangers. I don't know what my fate is." And that's the end of the main section of the book.
Okay, so that's kind of different than the show, because in the show, all the handmaids are going to be punished, but the ants want to trick them into thinking they're all going to die. But like,
Yes.
also that was stupid. They're not going to kill their only way of having babies in that society where that's the value they bring. So that like also didn't make
It didn't
sense.
make sense,
Like,
no.
I understand, like, obviously, yes, it would still be terrifying and traumatizing, which was the whole point. So she gets into the van, but she kind of does like, okay, because Nick said, like, trust me.
So in the show, Nick just
like,
says,
he
"Trust
knew
me."
that it wasn't, they weren't going to be murdered.
So in the book, the only real difference there is he actually uses the term Mayday. But if he's an eye or a guardian or spy, he might also know Mayday, right? Like there's no guarantee that means she's safe here. The ending is very deliberately ambiguous as to whether not she's being taken away by Mayday to try to get her out of Gilead, or whether she's just being apprehended by the eyes to be killed or tortured or whatnot.
So that's the end of the book, which is the end of the first season.
Yeah.
So it's kind of the same, with a few differences in like characters and their deaths or not deaths, but like generally
the main
it's-
plot points are very similar. The commander playing Scrabble, wanting to go to Jezebel's, Serena wanting to get her pregnant even if it's by someone else against the rules. The Emily character introducing there's a resistance here.
Did June have a previous child named Hannah in the book? Because that's huge too.
That is a huge thing. So June does have a previous child in the book. There is a Luke. There is a Hannah.
Okay.
Very importantly, thematically, June met her husband Luke when he was married. So they are.
So it's the same.
It's the same.
Storyline.
So she is an adulterer. Like,
right.
Basically, when Gilead took over, this is sort of revealed in the epilogue we'll talk about in a second. One way they got a bunch of women to be handmaids is they looked at anyone who got married, quote unquote, illegally, who had a child, and that became sort of their pool of women from which they could get handmaids. So they said if you didn't get...
Is that from the book?
Yeah.
Because that's not really explained in
know.
the show, other than like, oh, they have a red tag on their ear, which means you are a
Yeah.
handmaid. But it's like, how did they...
So the tag is, what they give them once they sort of caught them. In the book, it's just a tattoo on their ankle. There's no like GPS monitoring tag in their ear.
Well, I didn't even think it was GPS. I just
think
thought
in the
it was...
show it's suggested that there's some tracking
Really?
with that. Maybe not.
No,
I might be
there's not.
wrong.
I think it's just like the way they take cattle, which is just like a stamp kind of, but it's like a
Maybe.
metal clip on your ear, like an earring, but not really.
Yeah, but it's suggested. Yeah, like if you didn't get married, okay, because Luke was previously married, Gilead didn't consider her current marriage to Luke legal, and if that was an illegal marriage and she had a child with him, that's a very sinful thing to do.
Because I thought it was like because she was an adulteress, quote unquote, that's why they made her a handmaid, and I'm just like, how do they know that? Like I didn't. Okay.
The short answer is they wanted people who weren't devoted to their religion or hadn't gotten married in their state
in the
religion
traditional
church.
way, and then had a child after the marriage, and it was the first marriage kind of thing, like the perfect.
Well, they were just looking for women who had previously had children as evidence that they could have children.
Yeah, but if they did that, they would also find a bunch of wives, like.
Yes, so that's why they tried to use the excuse of, in the first phase of Gilead, they say they went for people who were like from previous divorces, second wives, like, so they could more obviously say like these weren't real marriages. But when they were running out of handmaids in the later stages of Gilead, it suggested they basically took any woman who could bear a child who didn't get married in the state church of the sons of Jacob.
Got it.
So they had to expand their pool eventually of the women they needed to basically kidnap to be pregnancy vessels.
Okay.
So a few differences that I think are interesting. You never find out your protagonist's real name in the novel. It's important to her. She talks about like wanting to remember it and hold on to it in case she ever gets to use it again. She shares it with Nick as a way of like, here's one person I feel like I can sort of open up to. The reason people speculated it might be June is that in the very first chapter of the book, it describes a scene of these women in a gymnasium sleeping on cots, like in advance of them being basically trained to be handmaids. And it describes how they just sort of learn to whisper to each other with their eyes and share their names with each other. And then it just says a bunch of names. And it says Emily, it says Alma, it says all the names, and then it says June last. And you never meet another June character.
But you meet the others and you know their real names?
So a lot of people speculate that was her.
So by
sort
the
of
power
tipping
of
her hand.
deduction, she was
So
June.
I think Atwood even said like she didn't do that intentionally, but she accepted that fan theory, and then for the show she is June. Okay. So I thought that was a really interesting touch. The book is more limited to Offred's perspective, her boredom, and her fading memories. A lot of what you find out about Luke and Hannah is described in a very dreamlike way, where she's even admitting she doesn't really remember exactly how things happened. And that's true actually of a lot of the story is told in a very like storytelling way. So even when she first goes to Nick on her own in sort of an act of rebellion and sort of just wants to, you know, do something for herself and has sex with Nick for the first time. The way she describes going to him, she describes like going to his loft above the garage. And she says, and it was like, she describes a kind of romantic scene of them coming together. And then she goes, I wish that's how it happened, but it actually happened like this. And then she describes something where Nick is much more cold and says like, I'm being paid to help get you pregnant. And then she goes, also, it didn't even happen that way. But the truth is like, I don't really remember how it happened. So like there's a feeling of unreliable narrator in the book that just can't really be present in the TV show.
Yeah.
I think the TV show visually, the way the show is shot, like very close up, very narrow depth, shallow depth of field, I think is trying to scratch at the same itch of feeling like from the handmaid's perspective,
it's a POV.
you are literally like wearing something that prevents you from looking at your surroundings. So yeah, in the book, you hear a lot about how like they can't even look up at their surroundings. The show is filmed in a way where sometimes you are reminded how small their world is and what they're allowed to know or see. The commander and Serena Joy are much older and meeker in the book. I think I prefer the book versions of them in terms of them representing this sort of like the like a gerontocracy of like these shitty old people ruling society feels much more relatable to me. That like, I mean, a lot of the problems we have in Western cultures today is that like our governments are run by, I mean, in the US especially, right? Like the amount of like 70 and 80-year-olds.
Yeah, there's like a grandfathering approach to it, right? Like people get in and then they never leave and they're hard to replace.
Yeah, so I actually prefer in the book that they're sort of these old and decrepit, and like you almost want to feel like sorry for them being pathetic at times, especially like the commander when he's like trying to impress June in a way, like when he takes her to Jezebel's and he like you get the sense he actually thinks he's doing women a favor in a way, because a lot of the justification as the commander gets more comfortable with Offred or June, let's just call her June, he basically asks her, like, hey, what's your opinion on all of this? Like, I can tell you're not dumb. Like, in the
Yeah.
book, she sort of knows better to really say much of anything at all. But you do hear a little of his justification for the society they've created. And he just starts talking about, like, how much women were disrespected before, and porn and beauty standards, and how women weren't treated well. And he's like, isn't this better? And, like, the only thing she
Isn't
really...
this better now that he and men can control them?
Well, I guess...
Because it really is all just a packaged guys.
But
right?
his justification is that, like, it's going to be better for the collective, even if there's some acknowledgement it's worse for some.
And the problem is like, says who, right? And now says them, which is a group of men, but people like Serena's character lend clout to this idea, and it becomes harder to argue because when you have people like Serena, a woman who's willing to say, like, yes, sacrifice women and their rights because it's the right thing to do, it's hard. It makes it harder for other women who are subjugated to argue when there's like one of your own saying, no, this is the only way. Now, I'm not saying this to say like, therefore it is right. I'm saying that's why it becomes harder to break through and have any argument when there's people like Serena. And you see this in other like real life scenarios too.
Yeah.
In, like conservative lines of thinking. But
in the book, I would say the aunts represent that problem more than the wives. The wives are almost framed more as like sort of sad, pathetic figures more than having much sort of real power.
There's a scene in the show where the I don't know if it was like the governor or the president of Mexico, I believe, who is a woman in the show. Is that the same in the book?
There's
Anyways.
Japanese diplomats in Gilead at one point, but they're at Jezebel's.
So I thought this was such a good and powerful scene in the show. But the president of Mexico comes to Gilead, and the premise is like, oh, she wants to see how it's run. Her country's been experiencing infertility. There hasn't been a new child born in 6 years. So she's like, what's up? We need to understand this. And she's appears to be coming from a place of, I want to see how things are run. I want to hear from everyone in the room, not just the men. So when she looks to the wives who are just sitting there all pretty, and she's read Serena's book, because Serena wrote a book in her previous life called A Woman's Place. Maybe we'll talk about that after.
Yeah.
But she goes, Serena, or Mrs. Waterford, like, did you ever imagine a society where women can't read your book?
Yeah.
Because you're not allowed to read in Gilead if you're a woman, if we glossed over that.
Yeah.
And she goes, there are all sacrifices we must each make in the name of God, or something like that. Like, God asks all of us to make sacrifices, which is such that's a non-answer. That's not an answer. That's just her trying to come up with something positive, so you can't really argue it. But like Serena does later on, even in her own fucked up, violent character's mind, in the show, she does experience, like, I think, cognitive dissonance, where like she did this to herself. And you see that more in like season 2 or 3, which is beyond the book. Yeah. But
we've seen that with like modern female conservative, right-wing sort of conservative figures, right? Even sort of acknowledge like they are not treated well by their male counterparts. And it's like, yes, werewolves ate your face, like, I do want to talk about the ending of the book. We haven't gotten into this yet, and what is different there. So after Offred's story ends, June's story ends with her being taken away in the van. You jump ahead to the year 2195 at an academic conference where some academic is giving in Nunavut, actually.
Really?
Yeah. Where they're giving a lecture about the Galadian period of history. And what they're describing is that researchers found a series of tapes that are the Handmaid's Tale. So in some like safe house in Maine, they unearthed these tapes that like you put them into a cassette player and they played music for a few minutes, and then that cut off, and then it gives you the story of the book you just read. The idea being like they were trying to hide it and disguise it within these tapes and potentially smuggle it out. They don't really know for sure. So it's never confirmed So basically, it's told from this very sort of cold, dispassionate analysis of the tapes. And you have this academic being like, and we tried to determine the veracity of, like, are these authentic, or was this just someone trying to fabricate these tapes to make money?
So you don't know if it's real?
I mean,
I know it's a book that's fiction, but
I mean, they suggest in their academic opinion, they think it is substantiated by history, but they just sort of describe how it was sort of, it is difficult to say with 100% certainty if it is true or not. So like they get into like their validation of the tapes seem to be from the correct point in history and not, you know, fabrications are inauthentic. And they talk about like, well, we have no names for who Offred is, so we can't really verify her identity.
Is this like set in the future?
Yeah, this is like 200 years later.
200 years
in the future. And it's basically suggested that like Gilead basically fell apart due to a bunch of civil wars, but like they've completely redrawn the map of North America since then. As a result, mostly of this conflict. You should pull up
the map of Gilead.
Oh, that's a good idea.
There is maps of it. I think it's interesting to know like what she conceived of America and surrounding areas to look like, and what was ruled by who. Yeah.
Yeah. So this ending is super polarizing. Like it gets a bit into. They say they found two different Freds who were commanders who it could have potentially been. One was Fred something, and the other was Fred Waterford. And they conclude that it's more likely it was Fred Waterford, who had a background in marketing and was more responsible for some of the decisions and how to help like people in this new society accept some of the crazy shit they were doing, the colors of what they were wearing.
Which he did contribute to as part of the architect of Gilead, or at least one of the voices. There was a scene of him like in a limo with his boys just talking about, oh yeah, we could market it. Like maybe he didn't use the word marketing, but like he talked about how they would term things, and it was kind of haphazard the way they presented that discussion. Like they just like, yeah, let's just call it this and then we'll rule the women.
Yeah. So Latter Day Mutant says, I'm really interested to see how well liked the epilogue is by the chat. When I read it in high school, all the members of my group other than me hated it. Very polarizing.
Is it hating it because all of a sudden it makes you question the book and it's being real even though it's not real, and you're like kind of annoyed? It's like when you read the end of a book and it was like, it was all a dream. Is it like that? That's frustrating?
So I'll give you my interpretation of it, and then it kind of explains, I think, why people might hate it. Like one thing it does is it really sort of diminishes the humanity of the June character.
Why?
Because they're talking about her as if she's just some artifact of history, and it feels very sort of jarring and impersonal and cold.
Because you just developed, like feelings for her, and now you're mad that it's like saying otherwise. Yeah.
You ending the poll?
Yeah, because to make another one.
Oh, what's the poll?
Did you like the epilogue?
Okay, do it.
Can you put this over there?
You don't want the grapes? Don't put them on the floor. Menchie will eat them. Can cats eat grapes? Based on chat, I think most people liked the epilogue. I think I saw at least one person saying they didn't even see the epilogue, like it wasn't included.
What? What do you mean? It wasn't included in the book?
I thought I just saw someone say the epilogue wasn't in your copy of the book.
What?
Let's read the epilogue now. You put the grapes away, right?
They're on the kitchen.
Okay.
Why is she gonna eat them?
She wouldn't eat them, but they shouldn't. We should keep an eye on them. So the epilogue, I think, in a way that felt very relatable to me. I mean, we've both been to like academic conferences. I find sometimes they are lacking in the humanity of what they're speaking about. And I guess it makes sense, right? Like they're talking about what is ancient history to them essentially at this point. But it does, like they focus more on, they sort of speculate on her ending and conclusion. It seems more likely that was part of Mayday, her getting away, is what they think is the most likely interpretation. Especially because these tapes, how would these tapes have been made? It's not like she could have made them while she was a handmaid, right? So that would have had to happen at some point. But they also say they put a lot of importance on like Nick They basically suggest that Nick must have realized that he would be killed or get in a lot of trouble if she was found out. Mm-hmm. And so if she was being close to being caught by the state or being exposed for, between the Serena Joy issues, between, her issues with the commander, her partner just having hung herself when the eyes were coming to get it, it's basically suggested this was Nick's way of saving himself by getting her out. So even that interpretation from these academics, again, feels like another, June wasn't a meaningful player in this. It just feels like it's diminishing, again, her sort of own autonomy in the story. And there's even an aside from the academic in the middle of this, so that's saying oh, we shouldn't really judge the Society of Gilead for their customs because we're all our societies have problems, blah blah blah, which is such this cultural relativism that you hear in academic circles a lot, as if
they called Gilead genius at one point.
I don't remember that, but it's definitely the feeling that I've seen in my life of sometimes very smart academic-minded people think it's very high-minded to say, oh, I don't want to be ethnocentric, or I want to be culturally sensitive, so I'm not going to condemn some obvious intolerant and terrible things you see in other cultures because that's the progressive thing to do.
I'm just going to discuss it more as a sociological factoid and to entertain it that way and remove myself from having to weigh in on its legitimacy or validity or, give a meaningful opinion.
Yeah. So that was my interpretation of the ending. That felt that I sort of enjoyed, but it feels very meta and it's not really necessary. I think it's interesting that Atwood did it. And I think there's a whole secondary reading of the book that the book is about storytelling and about a lot of June even sort of writing her story is sort of even self-reflective on her being an unreliable narrator, or even her just sort of engaging in wordplay. And it's a lot about even the process itself of telling a story about yourself. So I think Atwood was just sort of more interested in that sort of meta aspect of it. But yeah, anyway, I'm curious on your thoughts on this because I don't know how they're going to end the show. They're ending it with the 6th season, apparently.
But there's been... The first season was the book.
Yes.
But there's been 5 seasons total now since, and they're filming the 6th or editing it, one or the other, and that's been already said to be the final. But so many seasons have happened since the scope of the book that it's already not the book at all. Right?
Yeah, that's fair. Well, and even the way the 2nd season right away gives an answer to what happens at the end of the 1st season that doesn't feel entirely consistent with the book to me already.
They kind of go off.
So it seems unlikely to me the show would end with this future academic look. I guess they still could.
Maybe
they could.
They might. I didn't know that, but I wonder if to respect Margaret Atwood's, they'll literally bookend it, by doing something in that direction. I wouldn't be surprised. But if I didn't know that information, then obviously I wouldn't think that. Yeah. I think the criticism of the show, and obviously, please no spoilers of the show, but what am I supposed to do? So much of this is related to it.
I kind of agree with that. Let's not get into plot points spoilers from future seasons. I want to watch the show now, and I haven't seen it. I don't really want it ruined all that much.
Okay. How do I... But I feel
do you have
a
high-level prediction for the ending of the series?
No, but it's not that I was going to say. I was going to say, I think maybe I could say this, but sorry. Not, whatever. But I need to express this.
Sure.
Is that criticism of the show for, seasons... I don't know if it started at 3 or started at 2, but kind of in the middle there was criticism that June's character never got a break and that people felt that it was a bit repetitive in terms of the violence or the subjectification.
Or just continuing to be the victim of the
being a
state.
little bit gratuitous level as opposed to it being more story building. Now, maybe that's just because that's what happens when you have season 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of a show that is based on this, obviously. So I wonder if at the end of season 5 ended on more of a high note for June, which was not common for her character in previous seasons. I think that was done. This is just my speculation based on the feedback.
Okay.
Now, I don't know that I agreed with the feedback because I think the point of the show is to invoke that discomfort and nail home the point that, like, yeah, it's challenge after challenge and this is what happens. But that's my interpretation of it.
Yeah.
I can still see why for, like, PR and pleasing people, they took it a different direction. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if they're going to do that for the final season and that ultimately it will be, like, good news for June and her future. If they did that, like, I don't know if I'd fully buy it, though. So I'm kind of, like, I'm worried. I hope that Margaret Atwood, in directing the narrative, it's still respected the point she wants to make with this story.
Yeah, I would argue I can't imagine a satisfying ending that works on the same level the book does. Because the point of the book is that the ending is ambiguous and unsatisfying, and maybe she got out, but even if she got out, what sort of life did she have after that without Luke? If she got away to Canada, maybe her best case scenario is she actually made it to England because Canada was still participating with the Canadian government and, like, deporting people back to Gilead because they didn't want to piss off their American neighbors.
Can we talk about Canada?
You want to talk about Canada?
Why is Canada the safe haven everywhere?
You want a map
But
of Gilead?
I want to find a map of Gilead.
Find a good map.
Yeah. Republic of Gilead.
But yeah, like Christina's saying, there isn't meant to be a satisfying ending, and I just feel like a television show,
Can I put this
I
on?
don't know. Yeah, just make it full screen.
This?
Sure.
So I always find it interesting how in shows and video games even, what are you doing? Canada is often painted as a safe haven, and in the show it's definitely that. They kind of allude to going up north or go to Toronto, and that's where the refugee base camp is for, I don't know if I'm, like, spoiling things.
Yeah, maybe no spoilers.
Okay, but, like, isn't that in the book that people read?
There isn't much about Canada in the book.
There's nothing about
Well, no,
Canada
it's
in the
recognized that people are trying to escape to Canada. She gets caught with Luke
Okay.
and her Hannah trying to escape to Canada.
But there's nothing from, or I guess because only from her perspective. so she
Even
doesn't
even in
hear
the
it.
epilogue, from, like, the broader perspective of history, they just sort of talk about Canada as, yes, people escape to Canada, but even then, sometimes the Canadian government would send people back because they didn't want to piss off Gilead. So there
Okay.
wasn't as
Yeah,
much
yeah.
world building about Canada in the book.
It definitely gets more. I think it's season 2 or 3, but
Yeah.
so I'm kind of, like, blurring them together. But yeah, Canada is often portrayed as, like, a safe haven, and that's where we're gonna go escape. But it's rare that shows or games unpack that past that storyline. It's always like, yeah, just go there, and if you escape, then, like, your storyline just ends. You know what I mean? There's no real, what's the consequence? And I do think it's interesting that that's unpacked more in later seasons because it's not as easy as it sounds or as, you know, whatever. And then there's, like, shifting areas in the geography of, like, where locations are where you can be free, right? Because it's kind of this ever expanding net, which I thought was very realistic. That, like, maybe Gilead, if you zoom out, does it tell you, like, what is... This isn't really the best map. There's another map I've seen that does a better job at, like, kind of outlining the boundaries of Gilead.
Yeah, but we wouldn't really know any of this, right? Like, I don't know where this is coming from. I guess the TV show suggests something like this.
Yeah.
I think this is interesting in that it really sort of... I think we forget sometimes that the show probably takes place in what is a pretty small geographic area, right? Like, they're in Cambridge, Boston, I think you learn, and how close that actually is to the Canadian border.
Right, so it's the easiest place by proximity to hypothetically escape to.
Yeah.
But I found it interesting that it didn't just become what is clearly, like, red states in America.
I guess...
But when she wrote this in the 80s, things maybe looked a little bit different.
I mean, red states, blue states have been pretty consistent for quite a while. I think in the book you really don't have much an idea of how extensive Gilead is, though. Maybe the show is different in that, like, you are not really given much confidence of how much of the United States has been taken over by a theocratic fascist government.
Yes.
We don't know this. Yeah. Where was my thing? Here's just like a few book club type questions, because Atwood has like an introduction to the novel where she answers these questions. Her answers are like right here. Is The Handmaid's Tale a feminist novel? She says these are the questions people come up to her and ask her about the book.
That's an annoying question.
It is an annoying
Like, what is
question,
this?
right? And I think her answer treats it like an annoying question. She basically says, like, if you mean a book in which like women are either perfect heroes or perfect victims, then no. If you mean I'm just writing a book about like women as human beings, then yes. So I like that answer a lot. I did want to briefly touch on Offred's mother. She's not in the first season of the show, but she's in the second season of the show. They talk about Offred's mother. And what you see of her is very much pulled from the book.
Okay.
So even though season 1 and the book are basically like the same story, there are still things from the book that I guess she still sprinkles throughout the remainder of the show that didn't fit into the first season. So they find out that her mother is like a second wave feminist. In the book, she describes going with her mother when she's young to like an event where they're burning pornographic stuff, which I misinterpreted the first time I was reading this, because you would almost interpret like burning pornography with like Gilead, with conservatives wanting to destroy pornography. But it's actually an interesting, because in the show, remember, there's a scene where she goes with her mother they write down the names of women who have been sexually assaulted, write down the names of the person who assaulted them, and they burn it and throw it into the air. In the book, it was, we went to burn like pornography that demeaned or degraded women. And I thought that was a really interesting difference, because in today's context, porn is seen in a much more sex positive light, at least in the context of where women have the autonomy over,
Not
sex.
to everyone.
Not to everyone, but you couldn't have made, in the show, the example couldn't have been, here's a bunch of feminists just burning pornography.
It probably would have been harder to
It would have been more
articulate,
confusing
like,
to people.
Yeah, I get it.
Whereas it was much easier to say, like, women take back the night sexual assault. The mother's also like shown in like a take back the night type circumstance in the book. And some porn is absolutely terrible. Hey, this is a boomer take by me, but I think it's a bad thing how progressives have decided how much porn is celebrated by people with progressive politics. I think even if I can agree that it is better for women doing sex work to have control and ownership over that, but you can't ignore the fact that even when that is the case, a lot of these women are being humiliated or subjugated or still controlled by men ultimately. So I would have had no problem with this sort of feminist anti-porn message today or in the 80s. But the mother character is similar. I guess I mostly wanted to talk about that difference and this idea of freedom to or freedom from. So like in the book, how the idea of Gilead is sold to these women, even the handmaids, is like, hey, you used to have a lot of freedom to do things,
and now
but that also resulted in you guys getting sexually assaulted,
and
or
now you're gonna get it again.
Getting
but
breast
it'll be
implants.
on a schedule.
She's saying you don't have the freedom to do those things anymore, but our society, you'll have the freedom from being exploited or having
So now
expectations.
it's because the exploitation is prescribed to them under the guise of religion or just the way that they've decided their society needs to function. But that doesn't mean it's not exploitation. And it's just another strategy. It's a tactic of the rulers of Gilead, of the commanders, to evoke the power and to do the exploitation As long as they have that justification, it's your biological destiny, girly. Like, you don't have a choice.
Yes.
But you're free to, from what? Like, to me, it's just such an obvious ruse. And I think Margaret Atwood's, I'm basing it off of the show, but I'm assuming her book does the same thing, is like, this is to prove a point. That logic of thinking where you're like, this is the rationale and I'm doing justification here, is not actually logical. It's a layer of paint. It's trying to make what you want and convincing people with something else that is going to make them feel guilty or they're already vulnerable to. So whether it's like, well, they believe in God. Well, God said this is how it's got to be. You know, whatever it is that makes you vulnerable to believing in the commandments they've decided for how this society is going to be run. And that doesn't make it okay, but they train people to think this is why it's okay.
But like, you know what we were saying I was saying at the very beginning about, like, I think a more believable dystopia is one where people are consent to this sort of their own subjugation.
Well, yeah, and that's what the
to me, like,
the president from Mexico believed at first. She was like, "Oh, you've chosen this life to be a handmaid. That's so generous of you." And then
but
June's
they
like,
know,
"Mm."
they know they didn't choose.
But
it,
like,
right?
why? Okay, I mean, I know this is a book, but why wouldn't it be the case that maybe the more accurate society is one where it's women who are capable of becoming pregnant and deciding that they will bear more children because they do believe that that is their biological destiny? And like, I could see that actually happening, and them doing more surrogates, surrogacy, and maybe making money off of that and becoming rich or something. Like, I can see if they provide that value to society, if infertility is increasingly a problem, then like, I would see them maybe rising more on the ranks of society instead of these wives who, like, sorry, but they're kind of useless in the show.
The wives,
like,
yes.
What? Someone please explain to me. Why are the wives put up on a pedestal? Now, I know they are not on a pedestal compared to commanders, but like, literally, what do? They don't drive, they don't cook, they don't do Martha doings, they can't have children, and that's their big point there, is that like, children are everything. They like, what do? They don't please their husbands, which is another tool that women are used for, but like, they're not allowed to do that.
They're essentially useless.
Like, they're literally useless in this society. So what's the point?
And in the book, the aunts teach the handmaids to have sympathy for them, because like, they say, oh, imagine being in their position where they can't give their husband a child. That must be so terrible.
It's just like,
for them.
Do you understand? If you follow their logic that a woman's role is her biological destiny to have children, if you accept that that's the truth under God's will or whatever, why are there wives? Why aren't the handmaids wives then? Like, it just doesn't make sense in their logic.
Yeah, but it makes sense in the way that these people are hypocrites.
Yeah,
and that they would still want to hold on to their own.
But it's so obviously hypocritical that like, don't they even like look at themselves for 2 seconds and be like, oh yeah, this doesn't make sense. Maybe we should rearrange in a way that makes sense so people believe us. In
the show, there's sort of this idealistic idea that the commander, I think he describes this to June, where he's like, hey, like, this generation is kind of gonna be fucked up, but once we have like more women capable of giving birth, you know, we'll have households where everyone is sort of in harmony, where like, husband is the head of the household, but the wife, the handmaid, the Marthas all sort of live in harmony in one home, and they don't, like, if we have more handmaids, we won't have to ship you around to have sex with all these different commanders. You know what I mean? Like, I think there's some he's trying to justify to himself that like, hey, now things aren't bad, but we're doing this so it can be good later. But it still denies, like, you know, the agency of any of these women to like have a loving relationship. You know, love is a big thing missing from this society, and that's sort of Offred's perspective too, right? Like, you're basically treating these women as cattle, as just vessels, right? And denying them any sort of agency.
And I guess the wives are also treated literally as like a trophy wife. Like, they serve no function. They can't help their husbands with work. They can't work themselves. They don't go shopping for oranges. They can't have children, most of them, right? well, not all of them, I guess technically there's some, but like, what is the point? It's all for optics. It's all for show. And what kind of society is one where everyone is just performative? And also, isn't it like, it just seems so boring. Like, like well, what are you doing all day?
They're knitting.
They're just knitting all day, like, girl, you know, like, and it's such a contrast. Even Serena's character, which is so complex, and I find her like very interesting because of the layers of that person. But like her previous life as an author or as an advocate for the cause or whatever, she was like one of the people writing the scripts for what Gilead would look like. And then the men lapped it up and said, sure. So she was like an intellect in that building of that world. And then when she's in that world, well, she's not allowed to do any of the writing or the building anymore because she can't have a place at the table with the men.
So yeah, I think the Serena character in the show is interesting in that sense, that she's like an architect of her own misery.
But she's in denial that it's misery, even though she's very visibly unhappy with all of it.
But this to me is the more believable aspect of the story and the world Atwood's build, that how many people would, if we're asking like, is The Handmaid's Tale like a prediction or something we should be concerned about happening in real life? To me, I could see a world in which more people embrace wanting to live a more as modernity,
a return to traditions,
as
that's an aesthetic.
As modern society increasingly becomes unmoored from sort of a cohesive national or religious or traditional identity, people generally feel that there's like sort of a, what's the term for this? There's a lot of anxiety that comes with the freedom to be anything or do anything. Like if I 50 years ago, I grew up and my dad's a farmer, I'm probably just going to be a farmer. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that
you had less options.
That is a very limiting.
And now there's too many options. It's analysis.
Well, I'm not saying it's too many options. It's a good thing to have these options and these freedoms and being in control of your life. But there's also a huge amount of anxiety that comes with that. And I think a lot of people would willingly choose a world that makes their world smaller if they thought it made it better for them, and could be sold that idea, even if it ultimately resulted in them having less freedoms. That to me is a much more believable world than women being thrown in vans and used as baby makers. And I'm not trying to diminish that, like, that is something that could happen. Like, you could imagine a society where women are treated so poorly as to be denied their humanity altogether. But I think it would take, I could see the former happening much more easily than the latter.
I saw someone make a point earlier about how the wives, their place is also because they are the type of woman who is to raise a child, but even if they're not the ones who can have a child. So the role of the wife is more like the proper etiquette and the perfect family, and that's why it can't be the handmaid who is the wife. So like, okay, if we accept that logic, it also is an obvious contradiction with the whole like biological destiny. So then it's not the wife's biological destiny to raise a child because they cannot have one. Right?
Is The Handmaid's Tale anti-religious, Christine?
If you are very religious, you may perceive it as such. I am not religious. I don't perceive it as overtly anti-religion. I think religion is definitely used as a tool in the storyline because it is, honestly, it makes it more believable. Because in some cases, especially with like women's rights, if you were talking about like abortion, religion is often used to prevent women from having that choice. So if that is the main reason why you can't do it, or according to some groups, then this is basically just a much more expanded view of those lines of thinking, but controlling all aspects of how women behave, what their role is by using religion. Now, I don't think that the men in the show are all extremely... Now, sorry, let me say this again. The men in the show present themselves as religious, and they like, you know, look to God or whatever, and it's all God's will. But I don't believe for a second that 100% of those commanders are like actually gung-ho about God. I think
Jezebel's
it's just,
is a good...
well, exactly. I think it's just a very convenient tactic and tool for them to be like, oh yeah, God, yeah. Because it's convenient for them to use that to have power over everyone under them. So, and that happens. That happens. And people do use religion in nefarious ways. Now, that's not saying that's all religion. That's not saying that's everyone who is religious, obviously. But just like other belief systems that aren't even religious at all, like people will always use a system and abuse it in a way because there's always going to be a proportion of people that realize they can benefit from someone's vulnerabilities and use a justification system to enable it.
So I think your answer is consistent with Atwood's, that she does not generally feel the novel. She doesn't feel the novel is overall anti-religion as much as it against religion as a front for tyranny. And she goes out of her way, at least in the novel, I think maybe this happens later in the show, that she does acknowledge other believers of other religions and how they are also victims of Gilead. So
victims of Gilead, yes.
Yeah. So I like,
they don't discriminate what religion you are as long as you can be a handmaid, right? They'll take you in.
No. So in the novel, a lot of the safe houses that are trying to get handmaids out are other Christian denominations that reject Gilead's the son of Jacob Christian worldview. And in the historical section of the end of the book, they talk about how the only really people some of the only people they allowed out of Gilead were Jewish people who said they wanted to go to Israel, because they sort of respected.
They let them out.
So here's a kind of. They sort of respected the idea of like, let these religious people go and be in their own holy land, because like they're trying to basically do the same thing.
Like they didn't want non-believers anyways, kind of vibe.
Yeah, but I mean, I think ultimately a lot of the Jewish people that stayed there just got killed anyway. But they said they privatized the exporting of those people to Israel. They privatized it. And it was cheaper for the boats to just dump them in the ocean than it was to actually take them to Israel. So it's actually like a very dark echoes of, you know, Jews trying to find a home after World War II sort of history to it there, described in the final section. But like, I guess the broader point is she does describe other religious people that aren't participants in this tyranny, right? And for her, I think she kind of almost goes out of her way to do that. So she's like, not all religious people are bad in this story. I guess the reason I don't love this answer and am not entirely satisfied with it is that I think one way you end up with tyrannical societies is that you don't criticize religion or religious thinking. And I think it is a little mealy-mouthed. It is a little weak to me to just be like, I'm only against religion if it's used for bad purposes, when there are a lot of bad ideas inherent to a lot of religions that are good cover for terrible things and people wanting to justify terrible actions that we would normally recognize as terrible, that people use the cover of religion to justify. And people are told, like, you can't be critical of religion or you have to respect people's religious beliefs. I think that is a very slippery slope to a lot of terrible things, and that a healthy society is one in which we can criticize or ridicule people's religious beliefs. I was disappointed that she didn't want to engage at all with the fact that it's not a huge moral leap from the Old Testament to the type of society they want in Gilead. To like try to completely divorce that and just saying they're using religion for tyranny, they're finding a lot of fundamental aspects of religion can easily justify tyranny, and you should be able to criticize that without saying anyone who's religious is bad.
Yeah, and I don't like the argument like about sweeping statements either. Like you can have a critical book or show that does kind of get into this, and it's not saying the same thing as all religion equals bad. You know, like I don't think that's what it's saying. But
I kind of think all religion is bad.
okay, well, I wouldn't put it that way.
Okay.
If it hurts other people, then I might agree with you. But if it doesn't, well, I guess that's subjective, and that's the problem, is that some people perceive it as doing better for the world, and other people see it as, well, that's actually harmful to people who don't participate in it. And that therein lies the challenge. So
I think generally good people would do good things without religion. And I think a lot of people do some pretty crazy, awful things because of religious indoctrination. Mm-hmm. So on the whole, I am, Hallelujah to our monkey.
As long as you have the choice to practice what you choose, that I think is a more universally acceptable perspective.
I totally agree with that.
Yeah, like I would never want anyone to be forced to practice one way or another, and it does break my heart when like I grew up with people who were very much pushed into like dating people of their same religion because their parents said you have to. And things like that I don't like that. I hated seeing them like that. They struggle with that. And not that I'm a parent, but if I ever raised children, I would never. I mean, I guess it's different because I'm not religious. But if they wanted to explore something, great. But I would never tell someone what you should do just because your family does it. That's my perspective. I think that people should be open to choose their own path, learn what they would like to learn. Sure, parents and teachers can teach them about things, but I don't think there should be like discrimination or consequences if you choose something different for you. That's also power and control, but maybe not in the overt way that it is in Gilead, but that I do see it as a form of that. So I don't like imposing it on others.
I struggle with the sort of agency of people choosing religion, though, because people who are religious are almost universally just adopting whatever religion their parents indoctrinated them into, right?
But parents would hate that term of indoctrination. They think, well, I just want my kids to go to the same church and run in the same circles and have the same type of ceremony at the same age as I did.
And I'm not someone who's just saying any sort of religious aspect of your life is a bad thing. I agree with you that, you know, people should be able to practice whatever religion they want and be free to do that. I just don't want them subjecting that to other people.
But if you don't have knowledge of anything but the one your parents or your parish told you about, then like how could you know what's out there? How could you know there's any other options?
That's the thing. Like in like early new atheism debates of like 20 years ago, there was sort of this question people would debate, like, is raising your child in a very religious way child abuse? And I think that's a pretty extreme
I wouldn't
online take. But I think if you raise your child with a religious worldview and deny them the opportunity to learn about the world from any other perspective,
or tell them anything else is wrong, bad.
I do think that is I don't know if we need to use inflammatory terms like child abuse, but I actually think that is a terrible thing.
I think it's disillusioning. It's kind of malicious.
Like, it's one thing to teach your kid, like, oh, the world's actually 6,000 years old, and some guy survived in a whale, and women aren't worth as much as men. You know, if that's what you want to teach your child, I guess you have the freedom and right as parents to do that. But if you also deny them the opportunity to read a book about how the earth is older than
and that's what the Handmaids, that's what Gilead is. Women,
it's the denial of learning
children,
any alternative.
presumably, are denied from reading books or learning about anything from before. They refer to before Gilead just as before, and any relics are banned. So like the Scrabble thing is banned. Magazines from the past are banned because they don't want them to know about it, so they can continue to control the society and not have anyone remember or learn about the way things were before.
Importantly, this is clear in the book, I'm not sure about the show, women aren't allowed to, the Bible is kept locked up. women aren't allowed to even read the Bible.
How do they cite passages?
I
Which
guess
they do often.
They incorrectly cite the Bible
in the book?
both the show and the book. Like there are times where they
deliberately incorrect. I don't know.
Or that they'll say like the first half of a passage and then leave out the conclusion that changes the meaning of it. And it's a very
But I thought that was like convenient.
But that's the thing. That's exactly that. It's a very deliberate point to say they're even protecting other people from looking at these foundational religious texts in case they come up with an interpretation that doesn't support their organization of society. Of course, right? So it's not just that, hey, I'm not allowed to read a fashion magazine from before times. They don't want them even reading their religious texts in a way that could be... Because a lot of religions, all the major religions mostly, have gone through periods of reformation where people have fought and died over changes in how people choose to accept and interpret religious beliefs, right?
So that's why in the show, it's always the man who's like opens a book and like reads passages because he's allowed to read from it. But he's also in control of the household and can choose where to end that sentence.
Yes.
Because that's the context he wants today.
Mm-hmm. And this is true of like how most people even practice religion, right? How many people are observing 100% of like the religious edicts of their biblical or religious texts? It's impossible. But like that just never happens.
And it's used strategically, right? Like there's some sentences that people will interpret as like, no, this is literally. And then there's other sentences where it's like, oh, that was never meant literally. That's just metaphorically. But it's like whatever you believe in your IRL situation, and then you decide how to apply a text that you partially believe in, or decide what to apply more literally and other parts not really, you know?
Yeah, it's generally the case that in more advanced or modern societies, these religious texts are increasingly taken as metaphorical or as sort of like moral stories and not literally true.
Can we talk about the men? Because...
Boo!
No, relax.
Men! Boo!
No sweeping statements.
It's a joke. It's a joke. Come on.
I think...
You didn't like...
No. I think it's interesting that... we didn't even talk about the colonies. Is there colonies in this show? Just quickly, in the book?
So it suggests that Offred ends up in the colonies.
Are they all women who are laborers in the colonies in the book?
Something we definitely we should mention at least once. Other than women, it suggested that gender traders were in the colonies. So men
could be either.
Basically gay people were seen as anathema or traitors to humanity in this story. So they were treated
so they went to the colonies.
Just even more poorly than women on the whole.
The colonies is like slave labor, basically, where you just... I don't even know what you're doing.
So
like,
it's suggested like that they're trying...
Soiling and stuff?
I think like it's heavily implied that there were a lot of environmental disasters that contributed to infertility. And I think it's suggested that working in the colonies is trying to clean that up.
Okay.
So they're being exposed to the radiation of some like nuclear accident.
Yeah.
I guess in the hopes that maybe one day that land is usable again.
Yeah, I mean, I would love a scientist to like comment on how that, like, what could they possibly be doing and is it effective? Like, what are they doing? Or is it just punishment for show?
People are
like,
saying
it's not
like
really.
toxic waste, nuclear waste.
But like I don't know.
What are they doing?
What
with
does that
shovel,
amount to? Like,
know?
what are they shoveling? Is it working? Like,
or is
the
just
air getting cleaner? Like,
yeah. But it's kind of ironic that like because they're so anti-science. Yeah, would they just reject that there actually could be a more scientific remediation that could be happening in these places?
Yeah, like, are they running tests? Is the air getting better? But sorry, I wanted to ask about the young men specifically. We know how women are recruited and kidnapped into Gilead. Like, they find women who had successful pregnancies previously and they literally kidnap them. That's what happened to June, and you see that in like the first episode of the show. But what you don't really see, with the exception of Nick's portrayal in the show, is like all of the young men who are lined up as security, as the guardians or the eyes, There's so many of them. There is a disproportionate amount of armed forces presence to people who live in Gilead. Who are all of these men? And how did a bunch of 18-year-old men decide to just fall in line and do all this? To me, that's the most, like, not the most, but one incredibly unbelievable thing. I can't imagine a bunch of but they're also behaving themselves because they're not just doing like GTA. Okay. Like, they're all like following orders. There's so many of them. They could do whatever they wanted because of their numbers and theories, but they're just like silent
the Guardians.
Yeah, like it's kind of like, and they're all so young. These aren't people who could have been trained for many years. No. That's why I'm like, I find that hard to believe.
They're Andrew Tate followers.
Yeah, and they're all like 15. Like, what the fuck?
But this is not an aspect of the story I find difficult to believe, that a bunch of young men could be
but they're too well behaved is my point. Too well behaved for Gilead. I don't mean for real, but you know what I mean.
There's something described early on in the book where I think this is the first time June and Emily are walking around as handmaids, and they're walking past a checkpoint where like these two younger men have to let them through to go shopping. Mm-hmm. And she notices that they look at them with like a lot of desire. And it's sort of recognized in the book that like a lot of these men, like, they may be benefactors of the society and they're not subjugated like the women are, but at the same time, like, these men will probably never be given a wife, and they don't know what it is to have a loving relationship with a woman
So
either.
how can they all just stand there so still? Like, I don't believe it.
I agree.
And give them all guns. Like, are you crazy?
But maybe this is the eventual undoing of a country like Gilead would be, right? If you have a basically military force of young men with weapons that have been promised something, if eventually they see no pathway to that better life, how long would they prop up the regime of 80-year-old commanders who can't even get their handmaids pregnant? Right. I think that would be erode itself pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. That's why using violence to organize a society will never work long term. Maybe in the people's eyes it's a short-term solution, but it'll never work. And it'll never really give them
violence always,
the society that they think they want, which is like a harmonious, happy, mundane, simple life. Like, there is nothing simple or harmonious about anyone's life, not even the commanders or the wives. And that's like part of Atwood's, I assume, like the point she's trying to make is like, you can't just restructure society and use a bunch of violence and force to impose it. You're gonna love this. You're gonna fucking love being in. Like, no, you're not. But no, you're not.
What's terrifying about this sort of future the book presents, though, is like, after a generation or two or three, would people just accept this as normal? And that's the real. That is the dystopia, right? That is what's terrifying. I mean,
I do think there will be like a latent a plateauing effect where you're not going to have much resistance. But it's only a matter of time in societies and social circles that were built on violence and threat and control for that to basically dismantle itself and internally combust with violence. Yeah. Spoiler alert.
I mean, I think we're talking also from like a North American bias where, like, I think
Sure.
I think Atwood very much, one reason she wrote this book, it was she wrote it like as the USSR was dissolving. And I think she describes in the introduction to the edition I read anyway, that you would hear stories about like people being disappeared overnight. And I think she wanted to explore the idea that we shouldn't be lulled into this false sense of security that some sort of totalitarian government couldn't come into force in the West. Like, I think a lot of North Americans are very comfortable with the idea that, like, oh, dictatorships, that's something that just happens on the other side of the world.
I know.
So the book is very deliberately trying to force you to consider, like, how much would it really take for an authoritarian government to take over in your sort of comfortable Western world.
And there has been some examples that people have drawn parallels to The Handmaid's Tale. And The Handmaid's Tale was written like in the 80s, and the show was slightly more recent, but still, right? Like January 6th is like one example of people, an attempt to overthrow a democratic government, and something kind of similar happened here in Canada, although I wouldn't really explain it as quite the equivalency. But like just that sentiment was part of the premise of Gilead, where the government was overthrown by these radical people with a different belief system.
Yeah.
So when something like that happens in North America, you're like, what? I that was in a book. The book went way worse, way more south. But like that is why the book and the show is terrifying, because there's little nuggets of something that actually did happen here. And then more recently, with taking away the freedom to get an abortion in certain states in America, and legislation that was passed deliberately to just like stop you from having a choice, or to make it harder for you, or to punish you should you travel to another state to execute that choice, is very reminiscent of Gilead and the logic behind it and the justifications they use for this, or to prevent you from that option. So while we are not Gilead, it's understandably terrifying, and that's why so many people either love the show in like a weird way because it gives you validation in a sense that you're just like, see, this is an example of like how bad it could get hypothetically in a fiction show if we carry down this path.
There's a reason the show feels very relevant today and has a resurgence in popularity. It's partly because it was adapted to a TV show, but I think the reason it's resonating with people so much is that, when you do have things like abortion being criminalized in certain states, or even like trying to leave a state to get an abortion, it doesn't feel so far removed, the idea that there are people literally in positions of power who would prefer a society of The Handmaid's Tale as opposed to what we have today. That's
literally some political platforms. Like they platform on basically returning to traditions and the family being the most important, which sounds great to some people.
They don't run on the idea of enslaving women, but they do.
No, they wouldn't put it that way.
They do unabashedly, celebrate the idea of controlling women's bodies.
Because it's the right thing for everyone or something. I don't know.
I mean, maybe this is a controversial take, but like, wouldn't you like, with the overturning of Roe versus Wade, it returns the decision back to the states, like what abortion laws should be. And ideally I would prefer that's just like a right enshrined to all people and guaranteed. But it does occur to me that The Handmaid's Tale is basically like a future where if you basically just have the red side and the blue side, and only one of them wins at the same time, it's a really terrifying gamble to take, that maybe it exchanges power every 4 or 8 years, or maybe at some point someone comes in and suspends the Constitution and stays in power. I actually don't think the idea of governance happening at a more local level is necessarily the worst thing.
Because you're kind of taking your chances
because
at the federal level?
It provides a little bit of protection that if you get someone at the federal level trying to do crazy things and taking away rights for an entire country...
But can't they still override state-based legislation in some circumstances? So, like, that's kind of moot.
I guess I'm just saying it's maybe not the worst thing in the world that more governance is happening at a local level. Now, it's awful for the women who are born into circumstances of...
And they can't move.
Just by circumstance being born into a state that is more regressive. And I'm not trying to minimize that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it seems to me...
You can't just move.
Like, what's better, the U.S. heading for like a literal civil war, or just pockets of states sort of existing a little bit more independently than they do now?
Speaking of civil war... I also thought
good time.
I also thought the introduction of the show, and they set up how they were able to actually gain power, is they intentionally had these kind of false attacks on the Capitol, on other important political locations in DC or around Boston, and I can't remember. But they did like a 3-strike attack, which was intentionally done to scare the people, to put us into chaos, to make them think, oh, there's terrorism and, you know, we need order, and then therefore let's overthrow the government and the structure.
It wasn't just a false flag, though. Isn't it implied it was a real attack?
I thought it was pretty clear. They were like, let's plan the attacks. Like,
no, I think
no.
That's not how I take. I take it that they attacked Congress and the White House at the same time.
But who attacked Congress?
The sons of Jacob, the militants.
Yes.
It was like a military coup, essentially.
Yes. So they could overtake.
So I think it's actually a terrifyingly, somewhat realistic idea of how you could overthrow a government if you kill a significant number of politicians and the president, and there's a vacuum. I think the military has to sort of take its place. And I guess in the show it's implied that there is still a U.S. military that has powers over some
parts
areas, but I think in the vacuum of elected representatives being wiped out, that is the chaos you need to basically turn it into just a war zone of what. And then you can justify
the forces you're about to impose, and that was very deliberately shown during like Serena and Fred's conversation when they went to the movies. I think they went to the movies, and there's like a scene with like a bunch of people just enjoying their night out, and they were just sitting there like planning the attack. Like, and that was to show like the juxtaposition, right? Yeah. But yeah, like I thought that was very clear that it was just showing how radical groups were literally using fear and scare to tell everyone and signal like, your world is in shambles. We are making it worse, but we're doing it for you. But it's not for you. It's for us and our belief system.
Yeah, scary.
Wild. People are crazy. Okay, don't trust people.
What's next?
Donkey Kong.
It's Donkey Kong December. Are you going to watch the Planet of the Apes with me tonight?
No, it's so creepy. I can't watch it. Cannot do it.
Tonight we're watching Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. We're watching one of the Planet of the Apes tonight.
Okay, what's the Testaments? That's her next book, right? Is that supposed to be like season 2, 3, 4? I don't know.
So this was the last Booktendo of the year, but I did pick up a copy of Testaments that she wrote as a sequel to The Handmaid's Tale. I know you can't read. Was that
written? Yeah, I'm not allowed. I'll get a finger chopped off. Is that written as season 2, 3? Like what?
So do you want me to give this away?
Yeah, is it about season 2, 3, 4? No, it's not. Okay.
It's not. And it's they are going to make it into a show.
They're going to make the Testaments in a show?
It is.
Woo! Is it the same characters?
Yeah, without spoiling anything, at least one of the characters is the same.
Okay, cool.
I think you'd be surprised who. I did read a brief sort of no spoiler synopsis. It takes place quite a bit after the events of the book.
Got it.
But one of the characters is the same. And I've heard it does more, whereas The Handmaid's Tale was very much like, here's the experience of this one person.
Yeah.
Testaments is a little broader in that it follows multiple people and does do more of the sort of world building that I think you like, more of the sort of context.
Yeah, I would have liked to hear more. They unwrap it a little bit more in like future seasons of the show, but more about like how this happened and the justification used for the infertility crisis. Like how much of it is environmental. What tests are they doing to determine whether or not you can get pregnant? Like, they have medical labs and hospitals, but it's like, how are they making these determinations? There's just stuff that isn't really explained to me that I kind of want to know, but not that it's that important to the storyline, but like the history and the context, and also more about location. There's a lot more on location in Canada and like travel in future seasons, which I like because it's like painting the rest of the world.
Yeah, when I found out who Testaments is about, I felt kind of
Chris is gonna be so excited. I'm gonna be excited. What does that mean? Why am I gonna be excited?
I don't know. We'll see. So I was wondering, like, I have a copy of Testaments. I was thinking about just reading it now, but I actually think I want to watch the show. I want to catch up to the show. And I think I want to watch how they end the show before I read Testaments, and then before we watch Testaments, whenever that comes out.
When
in 3
is
years.
Testaments coming?
Well,
in?
presumably
I've
they
never heard of
wouldn't
it.
even. I think they announced, I think last year, that they were working on developing it, so that when The Handmaid's Tale ends, they would then
be able to launch.
be able
the
to do Testaments as its own show.
Okay. Is it the Testaments or just Testaments?
I think it's just called Testaments. Is it the Testaments? I don't know. It's well reviewed. People like it.
Where is season 6? Oh.
That's what I wanted to ask you,
Girl.
because if I want to finish watching the Handmaid's Tale series before I read Testaments, there's no indication when the last season's coming out.
I
at this
tried to
point.
Google it the other day, and the last thing I could find was that 2 years ago they said it would be in 2023, and that they tend to do one a year, but 2023 is almost over, and I haven't heard anything. So I'm guessing 2024. But I need it, and it's the last season, and I would like to know.
Was it impacted by the writers' strike? Is that why
Maybe,
it's
yeah.
delayed? That makes sense.
But I thought they would have already filmed it. That's why wasn't really.
If they haven't filmed it, you're going to be waiting a long time now.
Yeah, I remember seeing pictures like on set though, I swear. So I feel like
they
it was
haven't.
already filmed, but I don't know.
Okay.
I just did a quick Google, not an in-depth. I just assumed Handmaid's Tale was canceled. Oh, no.
Why would you assume that?
No. I mean, I do appreciate that there was criticism in the middle seasons because, like, people just weren't happy feeling like their main character they've fallen in love with wasn't making progress in their eyes.
Yeah.
I don't think that made it a bad show, and I still want to continue to see it through, but maybe some people did feel that way. But
Yeah. So anyway, I guess we'll put that on pause. I do want to start reading nonfiction next year, but I'm flirting with the idea of maybe alternating as opposed to just saying all of a sudden we're only reading nonfiction. At one point I was thinking, why don't we just do 2 books a month, one nonfiction and one fiction?
that's a lot of reading.
That's a lot of books.
That's too much reading.
Is that a lot of books though?
Yeah.
I don't know.
You're always reading the book in, like, the last 2 days.
But that sort of proves my point. I could read the book in the last 2 days of
I'm gonna
a
get
2 week
so many
period.
fingers cut off. I won't be able to paint my nails.
I have a list of nonfiction books I posted in Discord, and some of them were clearly favored over others. So I'll, at some point in early December, in the next week or two, I'll at least pick one for like the first month or two. And then I was also thinking, so if this year we're only watching movies about monkeys, I kind of want to do like documentary January, I think.
About Jane Goodall?
It doesn't have to be documentaries about monkeys.
I just thought it matched. Match your monkey to your donkey.
Match your monkey to your mood. And then we're playing The Last of Us next month.
Are we? What's
Yeah.
next month? January?
January.
Or December?
January.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh.
Jane Monkey.
They're re-releasing the game.
Pretty Little Monkeys.
Pretty Little Monkeys. The Secret Life of Monkey.
Grapes of Monkey. Catcher in the Monkey. Monkey of the Jungle. The Monkey's Tale.
Look what I've created.
Go piss monkey. XOXO. Monkey. Simply thanks for coming to Booktendo. You're welcome.
There's a Booktendo
I was invited
group?
by the man, so it was allowed.
You are dismissed.
Wait, you have to say go to your room.
Go to your room.
Praise be under his eye. May go with grace. Wait, what else did I say? May the Lord open. Go with grace.
Under his eye. Thank you for joining us, Ben. This was a long Booktendo. Oh, yeah, I don't think I'm filming a podcast now. Let's just delay it another week. It's like 4:00. Wah. All right, I gotta go. Thanks for hanging out. See you tomorrow? Maybe? Yeah. I think I'm just gonna play Donkey Kong again. Or I'll see you tonight. Yeah. Monkey, 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 monkey.